you to this week speaking part 2 questions. And in this week part 2 question, the topic is describe a situation you remember when you had to use a foreign language to communicate. In this is the question, and in the cue card there are 4 clues. The first one is you should talk about what you were doing then, what happened, how well you communicate in the language, and explain why you remember the situation or experience. You might remember, in speaking part 2, we will have 1 minute to take some note and then 2 minutes to speak. So the most important thing when we start is that we need to be able to understand the question very well before we even take note. Because if we don't understand the question, we will go off the track and we will not be able to fulfill the task respond. So what is the question here? The question here is you have to describe a situation or an experience that you had. If this is experience that you had, it means that something that you went through and you have to use past simple tense to describe it most of the time. Of course, it doesn't mean that you cannot use other tenses. For example, past continuous or past perfect, but most of the times we will have to use past simple tense. And the other keywords in the question here is a foreign language. What does it mean by a foreign language? Does it have to be English all the time? The answer is no. You can't speak about a situation when you use Korean or Japanese or Chinese to communicate. Right? And next step is think about your answer and brainstorm. Think about when you have to communicate. Right? Probably you have to communicate using a foreign language in what situation? I can think of situation like in the classroom when you have to communicate with your lecturer, or when you have to communicate with your English teacher in language center, or probably you will have to go travel. You have to let's say travel abroad, and you have to use the language to communicate with the airport staff, or probably you have to communicate with the hotel staff, right? And can be a situation when you just go to the park and you want to practice speaking with your foreigner friends, or it could be a situation when you are in a video conferencing at work and you have to speak English to the other workers who not from your own country. Okay, so you can think about plenty of situations where you can use English to communicate, and something that you remember about it. So what could be the thing that make you remember about experience when you use a foreign language? Probably it is a time when you have a misunderstanding, or probably it's a time when you um, receive compliments for using the language well, and you find it is a source of inspiration or a source of encouragement later on in your language learning journey. Right? So my what I want to say here is the experience. It can be a good experience or it can be a bad experience. Right? So that is the first step, right? Even before when you take note, right? And when we take note, try to briefly answer 4 clues. Remember, there are 4 clues in the question. When you close your eyes and you still have to remember them, right? What were you doing then? What happened? How well you communicate the language, and explain why you remember the situation or experience. Right. So when you take note, by doing this, you will have a picture in your mind, and you can visualize that in your mind, and later on when you speak, it's easier for you to utter the sentences, and as in other words, it helps you to maintain your fluency, right? Or some student asked me whether they should change the order in the clue cards or whether or not they don't have to follow these clue cards. My answer is no, because when you speak and if you follow these clue cards, you will be able to organize your talk in a more well organized way instead of like, speaking out of your mind and your answer gonna be like all over the place because um, the beginning, the information that you already mentioned there, you will repeat it again in the conclusion, and it's not a very easy to understand talk, or it's not a very logical talk. Therefore, right, so as I mentioned earlier, when you question in speaking part two, remember that we have to cover all the questions in the cue cards. And as I mentioned earlier, right, there are at least four questions, right? What happened then? What were you doing? And how well you communicate in the language? And why you remember this situation or experience. Right. So when you're doing this, right, remember that we will take note like under the four bullets, right? We will not take note or write out like anything that came out of our mind like this. Look at this note, right? We cannot just write down everything here without organizing, because your 1 minute you 1 minute is everything that you have to prepare for your talk later on. And if in this 1 minute you don't do well, I mean, if your note is not very well organized, so it doesn't help you much, because when you talk, it's still like as I said earlier, it's still the information is still not very well organized, and it's gonna be repetitive because you forgot that you already mentioned them, or there is some information that are important but you forgot to mention later on because you thought that you already talked about it earlier. Right. As consequences, suggestion is here, right? You take note all the question in the cue card, but you also have to follow the order of the question in the cue cards. Right, for example, you can see that here all the informations on the cue card, and then I can organize them again under the four categories only, right? The first category, answering question number one, what were you doing? I was on holiday in my summer break, and I have a difficult situation when I want to hire a car, right? How well you want to communicate in the language. Well, I forgot about what I learned, and I didn't know what to say in English or in Japanese or in Korean at that time. I find it very difficult to utter the words out of my mind, out of my mouth, even when in my mind I thought about the sentences or I arrange everything ready in my mind, for example. Right, so you can see that here, when I organize information in this way, it's easier for me to talk later on. Right? I just have to follow these ideas. That you need to pay attention to is in your talk. You also need to be able to use some of the adverbs to mark the stages in your story. It's easier for people to listen to, and it is more appealing when you listen to someone's story, because like probably human nature, we are curious and we want to listen to the other people's stories, right? And when we listen to other people's stories, so it's very important that you have to mark which happened first and what happened next, right? And what happened in the beginning, what happened in the middle of the story, and what happened in the end. And to have the listener easier to follow, we have to use marks in stages to mark your story. So if you have a look at here, you can see that there are some of the recommended phrases that you can use to mark the stages in your story. For example, when you talk about something that happened long times ago, right? And you can use those phrases like a couple years ago or several years ago, right? Or when you want to stress something that happened right at the moment something had before something else, just before something else has happened. So you can use the phrases as soon as, right? Or if you want to express the two things that happen at the same time, and you can use the word at the same time. Or if you want to stress or you want to mention the ending of a story, so you can use the word eventually or finally, right? So these are the phrases that help to mark the logical order of a story, or it will help to stress the logical order of a story or a sentence. In addition to we will say consequential phrases like this, we can use some of the phrases to express the reasons. Um, It is very important to express the reason or explain yourself or add more information in the talk, because if you don't do this, so it's very hard for you to be able to manage with 2 minutes limit in speaking part two. Therefore, you should try to use those phrases like this was because, or the reason why. So the next thing we did was, when you're doing this, it's very likely that you will help yourself to think about the reason to explain, or you will think about additional information to add, and definitely you will be able to um, make your answer more details or longer at least, right? Okay, so here are some of the tips for today lessons, and here in the following slide is the question for you to practice for today lesson. This is a question that gonna be posed on your assignments box and your discussion forum, and this is the questions. Right. Describe an English lesson that you really enjoyed, right? You should say where and when it took place, who was the teacher, what you did in the lesson, and finally is why you enjoyed it so much, right? So try to apply my advice into this question and make a success video. Okay, this is the end of the talk, and goodbye.